I'd like to think that everybody can hear me.
Yes.
If you can hear me, put up your hand, please. Okay, enough people are putting up their hands. So we like to try and start on time. And I'm sure there'll be some people who will be joining us in the next few minutes. But we're up to almost 50 at the moment, so that's good enough to start. So I'd like to welcome everybody once again to our tonight's Zoom session with the Glasgow Friends of Israel. And tonight's a very special night because we have two guest speakers, not one. Usually we manage with one, but today we've been able to double the number of guest speakers, and they're both coming all the way from Israel. So one of the benefits of not having our speaker evenings in Glasgow is that we can invite speakers from all over the world, and we can have participants from all over the world. So for every...
And they're free.
Hang on a minute. For every cloud, there's usually a silver lining. And tonight's lining is that we've got two very busy individuals who spend all of their time trying to monitor and find out what's being printed in the media and what's being said in the media about Israel. And they spend most of their time trying to challenge and combat any kind of bias against Israel, of which there's many. So I would like to introduce Hadar Sela and Adam Levick. It just happens that 2 or 3 years ago, when we had our conference in Glasgow, Hadar was one of our guest speakers, and she spoke about bias in the BBC against Israel. But tonight we'll be able to speak to both Hadar and to Adam and actually widen this discussion, not just to the BBC, but other media outlets that exist in the UK. Because Adam and Hadar spend most of their time focusing on media in the UK. I'd like Adam, when he speaks, to talk a little bit about camera in general, but then be more specific about what's happening in the UK. And I think Hadar will concentrate mostly on her work with the BBC. So the plan would be that for the first hour or so, we would ask Hadar and Adam to respond to our questions, the questions I've got for them. And then we will open the meeting up to all the participants who will also be able to ask questions of both Hadar and Adam. Now, what we'll try and do is vary it between chat questions, but we'll also try and give people an opportunity to speak and ask questions as well. So once we get to the question and answer session, if anybody wants to ask a question rather than write it in, if you put up your hand, we'll try and give you an opportunity to ask that question. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is ask Hadar to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about how she got involved in the work she's doing. And then after Hadar is finished, we'll ask Adam to do the same. So if we can unmute Hadar, we will ask her to speak.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, hello Hadar, how are you?
Great. Hi everyone. Lovely to see you all again. Lovely to be with Glasgow Friends again. Yeah, it was 2 years ago, October 2 years ago, when I came to Glasgow to see you all and my grandchildren in Helensburgh. So how did I get involved with this whole business? Well, actually purely by chance. I'm a registered nurse by training, but in 2006, in the summer of 2006, my mother died very suddenly, and I had to come back to the UK to sort things out. And I decided I was going to take a sabbatical and do all the technical things that needed to be doing and have a bit of a holiday and so on and so forth. Now, it was the first time that I'd actually been living in the UK for 30 years. And I was actually shocked by the change that had happened in the UK in the 30 years I hadn't been there, because I think in the post-war years, I mean, there was always anti-Semitism in the UK, but it was kept fairly quiet after the war. I think it wasn't very prominent. And then when I came back to the UK in 2006, it was as if the floodgates had opened, and this anti-Semitism had come alive again and become socially acceptable. And I actually used to say in those days that the only form of racism that was accepted in the UK was anti-Semitism. I started doing a few things on my own. There was a very nasty branch of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign near where my mother lived, near Halifax in West Yorkshire. So I started doing a bit of things to counter them and things. And then the 2008-2009 Operation Cast Lead thing in Gaza erupted. And the media was just absolutely horrible. And I'm sure you all remember it yourselves. It was a really awful period of time. So I rang up the Foreign Office in Jerusalem and I said to them, look, guys, I'm in the UK. I speak Hebrew, I speak English. What do you want me to do? And they said to me, get on the talkbacks and start trying to bring our information and the truth into the talkbacks. Now, the absolute worst was The Guardian at the time. It was horrendous. And especially the comments below the line, it was a real cesspool. And I started doing talkbacks and trying to get things clarified and challenging the misinformation that there was in the British media. And then a little bit later in 2009, I was contacted by a group of people who had formed a blog to counter the Guardian's anti-Israel bias. And it was called CIF Watch because the Guardian had this CIF Comment is Free, this platform where people could write talkbacks and so on and so forth. And we began, it was a group of people, some in the UK, some in Israel, some in the States, who were just sick and tired of the Guardian. And we began this blog, and it was, everybody was on a completely voluntary basis. It was, we were all blogging away in our pajamas. We managed to make some sort of progress, I think. And then in 2010, I came back to Israel. I'd gone for a year, but I ended up staying 3.5 because 2 of my children got accepted at university in the UK, so that dragged it out a bit. And I came back to Israel and continued writing voluntarily for CIF Watch. And then there was the May 2010 Mavi Marmara story, which I'm sure you all remember, the Turkish ship that tried to breach the blockade in Gaza. And we realized at that point that we needed to up our game. We couldn't just be voluntary bloggers in our spare time, in our bedroom, in our pajamas, writing posts. We needed to become more professional. And that's where Adam came in. So I let him take up the story from there.
Thanks, Hadar. Yeah, so as you can tell by my voice, I grew up in America. And like a lot of American Jews, my focus, even though I was pro-Israel, my focus was on American politics. And never really thought about Israel too much. I mean, didn't follow the news nearly as closely about Israel as I did about American politics. And then something happened. The Second Intifada happened. And let me get my cat out of here. And the Second Intifada erupted. And I guess, we all have that aha moment, that epiphany. And something about the way the media was responding and characterizing Israel's defensive measures to defend itself against Palestinian terror attacks and the eruption of anti-Semitism across the world. I kind of had an awakening, a Zionist awakening, and I had no experience in the Jewish or pro-Israel world. And so I just went to my local, my local ADL, Anti-Defamation League office, and asked if I could be a 35-year-old unpaid intern. And so they gave me that gig. At the time, it was just, I was learning and I was trying to get trying to figure out what I wanted to do with this. And eventually they started paying me a salary. So I worked for Anti-Defamation League for about 5 years. And then I kind of came to this conclusion that it wasn't enough, that despite the fact that I was, working for an organization, a very long and organization with a proud history of fighting anti-Semitism and to some degree advocating for Israel, that I started getting the Aliyah bug. So I made Aliyah in 2009. Was lucky enough to get a job with NGO Monitor and was able to get a couple papers published about anti-Semitism with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And then out of nowhere in 2010, at some 1 month, I got contacted out of the blue by, I guess, the founding father of CIF Watch, who will remain anonymous. He saw a couple of my op-eds that were published, and he was interviewing for the position of managing editor of this, up until now, grassroots volunteer organization that was still punching above its weight called CIF Watch. So after about a 3-hour Skype interview, he hired me. And so I began as managing editor of CIF Watch in 2010. By 2012, we launched BBC Watch, which, and Hadar was appointed managing editor of BBC Watch. And then just to fast forward a bit, at a certain point, I decided that there was a lot more to do beyond just The Guardian. And we had just became partners with Camera in 2012. And so after a few years of realizing that The Guardian's anti-Israel animus was getting a little better, that it wasn't quite as horrific as it had been in the years when Hadar first started, me, along with the Boston leadership of Camera, decided to change our name to UK Media Watch and to expand our focus beyond The Guardian to The Independent, to The Telegraph, to the Times, to Channel 4. And then we decided, just as a branding issue, to change our name to Camera UK, because a lot of people didn't even know that BBC Watch was part of Camera. They didn't know that UK Media Watch was part of Camera. And here we were, we grew into this organization from nothing that became, part of this proud, long organization called Camera. And so last year we changed to Camera UK, and Hadar and I became co-editors of Camera UK. Just briefly, I'll tell you a little bit about Camera. Camera goes way back to 1982. They were founded after, I guess, outrage at media coverage of the first Lebanon war, interestingly, which is around the time I would argue that a lot of the previously pro-Israel coverage began to change in the international media. And so now, after all these years, Camera is the largest, I would say most influential, most prolific pro-Israel media monitoring organization in the world. We operate in English, Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew. And so that's how I got to where I am today. And we have about 40 employees in the U.S. We have about 8 employees in Jerusalem, in Israel. And so I'm really happy to be here. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Adam and Hadar. What I'd like to do is focus in a little bit on the UK, because that's where most of your work is. And is there a difference, do you think, between the approach to Israel in the British media compared to other parts of the world?
I think there is. I think, first of all, that the British media allows itself to be much more critical, much more judgmental about Israel than, for example, the American media. I think there's a difference in the approach from the point of view, from the editorial point of view. I'm sometimes very jealous of our colleagues who work on the American media, because they zip off an email in the morning to an editor, then they've got a correction by lunchtime. And if I get a correction from the BBC, it takes 3 months if I'm lucky. It's the response to criticism seems to be much more positive in the US media, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. I think one thing I can say about the British media is that there's a blurring between fact and opinion. And I don't know how much you've noticed this, because British media is what you guys get. But here in Israel, in the media, it's very clear when a reporter is reporting the facts, and it's very clear when a different journalist is giving his opinion about the facts. And I think that in the British media, that tends very much to get blurred and mixed up sometimes. And so you often find opinion being presented as though it's sort of fact. I'm sure Adam's got things to add to that.
Yeah, it's interesting, everything Hadar said is true, but I guess looking at it from another way, in the UK, at least there's a culture of corrections. In the UK, there's IPSO, there's Impress, there's Ofcom. There's government regulatory power that oversees the media that doesn't exist in the US. Now, my two frames of reference when it comes to the media coverage of Israel is the US and the UK and Israel. Like I said, the US, there's no regulatory agency. In Israel, if the regulatory agency that exists still exists, it's toothless and is meaningless. So I guess, I would just say that everything Hadar said is true, except that I kind of like the fact that most of the major media outlets that I monitor answer to IPSO, Impress, or Ofcom. And so at the end of the day, if it's really hard to get them, and this is another story we'll get into later in the conversation, but when IPSO, Impress, or Ofcom tells a media outlet you must correct, they do. There's nothing like that in the US. So I find it interesting. Maybe it's because, for whatever cultural reasons there, I like the fact that there's this culture and this habit of taking complaints seriously enough that the government sees to it that there are regulatory agencies that oversee the media. Now, those are really imperfect, and I'm not saying that they do their job most of the time, but I do find that to be an interesting difference between the American and the British media.
Adam, some people might not be familiar with IPSO and Impress and how the process works. Could you maybe say a little bit about those organizations and how they tend to work with the media outlets?
Sure. I mean, the IPSO stands for, it's the Independent Press Standards Organization, and they were launched after the previous organization, Press Complaints Commission, folded, because they were seen as toothless and politically biased. And how it works for the media organizations that sign up to be regulated by IPSO is, first you must go to the media outlet and complain. And if they don't correct a complaint that you think is meritorious and you think is clearly a breach of the accuracy clause of the editor's code, then you can go and file an online complaint to IPSO. Now, the process takes a long time, and it's really hard to get a correction, but there is, I think, a relatively fair and transparent process. And, I think that by and large, media outlets like the Times, like the Telegraph, that are regulated by IPSO tend to be more conscientious about responding to complaints within their own internal complaint mechanism than the Guardian and the Independent, which decided that, well, they can police themselves, that they can be their own watchdog. So, but to answer your question briefly is, first you have to go through the internal complaints mechanism of the organization. And then if you're not satisfied, after X number of weeks, then you can go to IPSO. And IPSO has a relatively user-friendly how to make a complaint form that you should be able to follow pretty easily on your own. And once they adjudicate the complaint, which often takes months and months and months, sometimes less, but often takes months, then if they rule in your favor, then the media outlet has to correct, and they have to print the correction in a prominent space in the publication.
Well, I've had personal experience with that kind of incident. There was an article about Glasgow Friends of Israel in the Herald, the Scottish Herald, and I complained to the Herald about it, and they refused to apologize for that or to withdraw the comments they made. And so I actually got in touch with IPSO. And IPSO eventually, after many months, as you say, Adam, they actually ruled in my favor. and they told the Herald that they should make an apology. The problem was the apology was so small in page 2 or page 3 compared to the actual article that I was complaining about. I'm sure very, very few people were actually able to spot the apology. So although they actually do it, they don't make it prominent, and they certainly don't like printing any apologies.
No, that's a really good point, Sammy. And look, media outlets are they circle the wagons. Media outlets tend to be very thin-skinned, and they don't like to admit when they're wrong. But I wouldn't worry so much about where the correction is placed in the print edition. You know, in our experience, and certainly my experience, the correction serves two fundamental objectives. Number one, it embarrasses them because there's a public record of the fact that they were forced by Ipso to apologize or to correct something. Number two, they're less likely to make that same mistake in the future. It's just been our experience after all these years that mistakes they made that they're embarrassed about because they have to correct, they're less likely to make that same mistake again. So I wouldn't look at just the narrow picture of the actual correction, even though that can be interesting. I would look at just the impact of that correction. I think the impact of that correction is they're a lot less likely to make the same mistake again, and not necessarily because they're professional, although sometimes they are, but because they don't want to be embarrassed. They're very thin-skinned, and it's a win at the end of the day because they were forced on the record to apologize.
Hadar, I know with the BBC that although they might apologize, they don't necessarily go back and correct all the occurrences of the reports that they have made incorrectly. Is that right?
Yeah. No, they don't. They're very, very lackadaisical, maybe is the right word. Sometimes they put a footnote saying that they've corrected an article. Sometimes they don't. I mean, the BBC is an enormous organization. And sometimes you just get the impression that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing there. But there is supposed to be a standard way of dealing with editorial complaints, but it just doesn't filter down all the time at all. And sometimes they correct something, but then I have to actually repeat my appeal to them and sort of carry on bothering them until they actually put it on the corrections and clarifications page. I don't know how many of you know the BBC has a correction and clarifications page. It's not connected to their website. There is nothing on their website which will tell you, oh, we corrected this article that we published a month ago or whatever. But they do have a separate corrections and clarifications page, which keep for major important things. The small things they don't even put there. And it's very, very patchy and very unprofessional, to be honest. It's quite disappointing as it's a publicly funded organization.
But why do you think that the media in general is so biased against Israel? But what is it about Israel that makes them so important compared to some of the other countries in the world, which do what I believe are much worse atrocities or many worse things with human rights than Israel ever does? And yet all you hear about is how bad and terrible Israel is.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead.
Sorry,
go ahead.
You go first, Sarah. You go.
Okay. No, I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question, but some of the elements that resonate with me more and more over the past couple of years is the failure to assign agency to Palestinians, the failure to treat Palestinians as moral agents whose actions impact their outcomes. They're almost infantilized. Palestinians are not treated and they're not framed in a way that Israelis are framed. And I think that's because of the David versus Goliath narrative that has taken over at least since the early 80s. So if you're a journalist, and more and more journalists see their job as a form of their advocacy, and if they come to the region and they just kind of, it's in the journalistic atmosphere that they look at this as a David versus Goliath story. And so, they're very clear about who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, who's the victim and who's the who's the oppressor, and their stories are just naturally going to be framed through that paradigm. And there's also an echo chamber effect, right? Like, I think journalists very often hang out with other journalists, and they tend to just follow the herd. And there's kind of one way of writing articles about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's through this through this paradigm. But there's more than just David and Goliath. I think it's also, and I don't want to get too thickly into this, but intersectionality is a very, very insidious ideological movement. And I think, if anything, it reinforces the David versus Goliath narrative that has been part of the journalistic ether for the past 40 years. And that is, intersectionality kind of frames the world into victim and victimizers, and there's a hierarchy of victims. Now, within that hierarchy of victims, Jews have actually gone from the most historically oppressed group to the most historically privileged group. And that's because Jews are framed as white. And in this extremely facile binary tale of good and evil, Jews, by virtue of the fact that they're successful, Jews, by virtue of the fact that they're doing well, generally speaking, both in the diaspora and in Israel, are no longer seen as sympathetic victims. Whereas Palestinians are framed as the people of color. They're poor, they're downtrodden, and within this intersectionality framework, the roles that Jews and Palestinians play within the thinking of most journalists are steady. They're not going anywhere. This is the way that the conflict is going to be framed, because they view their jobs by and large as a form of advocacy. They don't view their jobs as much as they used to, I don't think, as professionals who are there to do a sacred duty of reporting the truth, but to advocate on behalf of who they think is the weaker party. So I think it's that failure of objectivity tinged with modern intellectual trends that really, I think, have a really strong impact on their ability to objectively cover the news.
Dar, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think what Adam says, the David and Goliath theme, it from a British media point of view, it fits in so well with so many factors within British society, which it sort of forms a perfect storm in a way. You've got this. The British are always traditionally rooted for the underdog. I think that's part of the story. You've got this PC environment today that I think dictates a lot of the narratives. You've got the UK political history. You've got the fact that the Foreign Office is involved with BBC World Service and the historic history of the record of the Foreign Office as, the Camel Corps. And I think another factor which cannot be ignored, and it may sound rather silly, but I think it's definitely a factor, is the ease of reporting from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a nice westernized city. You can get a beer in a bar at the end of the day. It's not Syria. It's not Yemen, where you can't get a beer in a bar. And it's a lot easier to sit here and produce stories. And I see a lot of stories on the BBC, and I'm sure Adam will agree with me, on other British media outlets. We have a lot of English language media here in Israel. I see a lot of stories that the guys just read the Times of Israel or read the Jerusalem Post, mixed the paragraphs up a bit, and created his own report. And it's very easy. It's very easy to report Jerusalem compared to most of the places in the Middle East.
It's interesting, Adam, that you said that Israelis are seen as white and Palestinians perhaps not so white. But of course, if you live in Israel, if you go to Israel, the population is changing and it's not as white as it used to be. And does that not have an impact on that?
No, that's a really interesting question and point, Sammy. Interesting, like in one of my posts recently, I don't know how many of you are following the American election, but I made the point that, a strong plurality of Israelis are in fact Mizrahi. That is, their family comes from the Middle East, and that the average Israeli looks more like Kamala Harris than Joe Biden. And that's true. I mean, that's just, you live here for a while, or you visit for a while, we're not white. I mean, I'm more white than most Israelis. But I think white almost has taken on almost like a metaphorical or some kind of symbolic meaning that is divorced from the actual literal definition of the word white and black. White means privileged, black means underprivileged. So I think we have to look at black and white not just as the actual colors that they are, but it's come on to mean something beyond what those words actually mean. But I want to reinforce what you just said. It's so true. Most Israelis are people of color, really, just by virtue of the fact of where they descend from and the color of their skin.
And of course, this is all complicated by the fact that anti-Semitism is in this mix. And so how do you see anti-Semitism impacting the way the media is reporting the Middle East and the other way around?
All right, well, go
ahead.
ahead. Okay, all right. Look, I think we have to be careful. On one hand, we're very careful about imputing anti-Semitism to individual journalists lacking real evidence. Whether they harbor anti-Semitic animus in their minds, we can't read their minds, we're not psychic, so I'm very careful about imputing anti-Semitic motives, except when those journalists use anti-Semitic tropes per the IRA definition. So, in all my years, there's maybe a handful of journalists that I've argued that their anti-Israel animus is motivated by anti-Semitism. One of them is Robert Fisk, just by virtue of the fact that he continues to use anti-Semitic tropes in his reporting for The Independent. But I think that the question of whether or not individual journalists are anti-Semitic isn't nearly as important as I think most reporters just don't understand anti-Semitism. They don't get it. They don't see it when it's in front of them. They don't. If you were to ask most journalists if they're familiar with the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, they probably wouldn't know what you're talking about, or they certainly wouldn't be fluent on it. And I think that you really can't understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if you don't understand the role that Palestinian anti-Semitism plays in the conflict. According to an Anti-Defamation League global poll of anti-Semitic attitudes, 93%, let me say that again, 93% of Palestinians harbor anti-Semitic views. They are the most anti-Semitic people based on that poll and polls in 2011 by Pew Global. It's not even close. And the fact that isn't front and center in media coverage means that news consumers are not going to understand they won't understand why, for instance, Palestinians are always complaining that the mosque is under attack, that Jews are storming the mosque. I mean, that's essentially an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It's something that has been motivating extremists to attack Jews for 100 years. And yet it's always framed in terms of he said, she said. It's a legitimate grievance, rather than a conspiracy theory. And I think it's because they don't understand the history of anti-Semitism. They don't understand the Grand Mufti. They don't understand that so much of the intolerance, so much of the resistance to Israel's legitimacy as a country by the Palestinians is motivated not by legitimate political grievances, but by old-fashioned Jew hatred. So, when you ask me about anti-Semitism, I think that that's the most important question, is why journalists don't understand it, why they don't take it seriously. And I think that goes back to a point I made before, and that is they don't see Palestinians as agents. They don't take them seriously. It's almost like they give them a pass, right? And I think that, they still see anti-Semitism largely as a far-right phenomenon. And again, in their mind, it's besides, they just don't take that seriously. So I think anti-Semitism plays a role insofar as journalists are clueless and refuse to hold Palestinians, and to some degree, or lesser degree, the broader Arab world accountable to the same moral standards against racism that they hold other groups to.
Hadar, people have views about the BBC, and the BBC obviously is a public organization, and you wouldn't expect the BBC to have anti-Semitic journalists. And of course, we all saw the program a year or two ago, the Panorama program about the Labour Party and is the Labour Party anti-Semitic under Corbyn? How do you see the BBC in this quandary with regards to anti-Semitic content or not?
Well, first of all, I mean, the BBC, and as far as I know, other British media outlets, they don't work according to a definition of anti-Semitism. They don't work according to the IHRA definition, which is the accepted definition of anti-Semitism, which I've been pushing them to adopt that definition ever since it came out, and they refuse so far. I've actually found quite a few. It's been a bit better recently since I started calling them out. But we used to have regular things where you'd hear stories of the horrible Jewish lobby and how they control American politics and how they control British politics and so on and so forth. We had one case where a journalist had no problem going on about rich Jews and you know, typical anti-Semitic stereotypes. I see a lot of use of the Livingstone formulation, the claim that people only call out anti-Semitism because they want to people criticizing Israel. I think that I personally think the BBC's record is quite miserable, and I rather think that the government could do more, at least for the BBC, because it's a publicly funded organisation, to ensure that they do adopt an internationally recognised standard of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, it's not happening so far. No,
Can I just ask? Obviously, you've both been doing this for quite a long time. Are there any topics that keep coming up over and over again that you try and challenge? And have you had any success? Can you tell us a little bit of the success you may have had in challenging some of these media stories?
All right. Well, I mean, one of the things that keeps on coming up, which is really hard to correct because it's hard to correct omissions, but omitting, you know, when they talk about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace issue, omitting that Palestinian leaders have rejected peace 3 times over the past, you know, since 2000. Omitting, even more amazingly, omitting the impact of the Second Intifada, both in terms of the impact on Israeli views of Oslo and just the impact on the region. So it's those historical omissions that are the themes that, you know, whenever we're reading something about in the Guardian or the Independent, it's almost as if they go out of their way to erase those unbelievably important eras over the past 20 years. Also another thing is this assumption that's usually unexamined that settlements are the biggest impediment to peace. Now, in camera, you know, we don't take a position on settlements as such, but I think we have done a good job, both Hadar and I, of deconstructing the assumption that settlements are the biggest impediment to peace. I think clearly that violence, Palestinian rejectionism, and anti-Semitism are the biggest impediments to peace. I think, if anything, the recent peace treaties between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan kind of prove that, right? That so I think the settlements are the biggest impediment to peace is such a almost like daily, at least definitely weekly, maybe even daily narrative that gets peddled in the British media that is so misleading, and news consumers are so misled by that. Now, as far as successes, yeah, I mean, we've done a good job. And again, I think this is through being consistent, persistent, and getting corrections. We rarely ever see the lie that there are Jews-only roads in the West Bank. My colleagues in Boston and in the Israel office since the early 2000s have been really trying hard to disabuse journalists that's ever been a thing. There's never, ever been a religious test for any roads in the West Bank. There are a very small percentage, maybe 7% of roads in the Palestinian Authority, or rather roads in the West Bank, that are prohibited to Palestinian traffic for security reasons. But even those roads are open to Jewish Israelis, Muslim Israelis, Christian Israelis, foreigners of all religions, you know, and that's not just a error. It's not just a false claim. It's a lie that begets the bigger lie that Israel is an apartheid state. So I think the fact that you really aren't going to find media outlets claiming that there are Jews-only roads in the West Bank is one of the things that we've really succeeded in. The other quick thing I want to mention is that for years the British media would try to argue that the Western Wall, the Kotel, is the holiest site in Judaism. And we had to remind them dozens of times that no, the holiest spot is the Temple Mount. Now, why is that important? Because by claiming that the Western Wall is the holiest site in Judaism, it suggests that Jews who visit the Temple Mount are interlopers, that, you know, what business do Jews have even visiting, let alone praying at the Temple Mount, if their holiest site is the Western Wall. So, you know, we pick and choose our complaints strategically based on the importance, based on the strategic importance. And I think the Western Wall holiest place is one of those corrections that might not seem as important at the time, but I think it begets a bigger lie. So there was, I think those are two good examples.
Hadar?
Yeah, of course, my biggest recurring issue with the BBC is the issue of not calling terrorism terrorism. They won't call anything that happens in Israel against Jews, against Israelis, even if they're Arab Israelis, they won't call it terrorism. They do call the exact same things terrorism if it happens in the UK, if it happens in Europe, or if it happens to UK citizens in places like Tunisia. I don't remember that big attack that was a few years ago against British tourists in Tunisia. They did call that terrorism. I've had zero success, I'm afraid. Not for want of trying. I constantly bother them on that topic, but zero success on that topic so far. And that's a political decision. I mean, they've admitted it's a political decision not to call people ramming a car into pedestrians in Israel terrorism, but you do call it that when it happens in France, for example. Another recurrent issue is the topic of the capital of Israel, because the BBC believes that we aren't entitled to decide where our own capital is. And they actually gave out a ruling on this several years ago. The BBC's, this is totally absurd, but I'm going to tell you anyway. The BBC believes that because in 1947, the UN wanted to do the partition plan and Jerusalem was a corpus separatum, it was supposed to be an international city, the BBC for some reason believes that UN recommendation, because even though it was passed in the General Assembly, it's not binding by any stretch of the imagination, and the Arabs rejected it, so it was a non-starter from the beginning. But the BBC believes that is the law, the rules. And so the BBC won't even call Western Jerusalem the capital of Israel. And there was a thing a few years ago, one of the Olympics, I can't remember which one it was, but they did a whole feature on different countries taking part in the Olympics and which country it was and where the capital was. And the only country that didn't have a capital was Israel, which didn't have one at all. And then people complained, but they also got a country called Palestine, which their editorial guidelines say they shouldn't have, because they shouldn't call it Palestine because there isn't such a country. And they had its capital, East Jerusalem. So there were a lot of complaints, and eventually they decided to write administrative center Jerusalem for Israel, but not capital. So I've had a lot of fights with them about that. I've managed to sort of stop them saying that Tel Aviv is the capital, because it's not. And they used to say that, but they don't do that much anymore. But they still won't say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Another thing is 1967. As far as the BBC is concerned, nothing worth mentioning happened before June 1967. So every story you will see begins in June 1967. Nothing about the Jordanian occupation, nothing about the status of the area as far as the League of Nations and the mandate is concerned. 1967 is the magic date as far as the BBC is concerned. I think another interesting, I mean, and maybe it's sort of a bit of a thing that only if you follow the media as closely as we do on a daily basis, maybe it's only if you do that, you notice it. It's how stories are actually created. And a recent example is this story of annexation of the West Bank. The BBC was running a whole load of stories because they really got into the campaign against what they called Israel's plans for annexation of the West Bank. Now, the topic of annexation was raised. It never went through the Foreign Affairs Committee. It never went through the Parliament, the Knesset. There was no plan. There was no plan. It never materialized into anything. But the BBC was running stories about Israel's plan to annex the West Bank. And it's little things like this that distort public opinion, in actual fact, and creating a story where there isn't one, in actual fact. As for successors, I think we've had a lot, but I mean, we get a lot of corrections, relatively speaking. But I think one of the things that I'm sort of most proud of is that the BBC used to open a lot of its articles on Israel for comments from the general public. And then some of the comments were absolutely disgusting, really anti-Semitic and full of conspiracy theories, and they were absolutely awful. And I started screenshotting these awful comments and writing posts about them. And I know for a fact, through contact at the BBC, that my posts got to the BBC, and some of the journalists there were horrified that their own platforms were spreading anti-Semitism. They've actually stopped opening articles for comments. So that's one fairly big achievement, I think.
Just to follow up on what you've said, you mentioned that the question with regards to terrorism is a political decision. I'm trying to understand what you mean by that, because clearly the BBC doesn't have any politicians working in that area. And to go back to you, Adam, what you said about the settlements, I mean, obviously before 1967, there were no settlements, and yet there was no chance of any peace agreement between the Israelis and the Arabs. So you can point to that as potentially the settlement issue is not really a hindrance to peace.
No, that's actually a really good point, Sammy. You're right. And like Hadar just said, you know, most media reports about the region, if they touch upon history at all, begins in 1967. That's when the news story, you know, that's the birth of the news story. And you're absolutely right. That's a really good point. And that's something that we haven't been as successful as we would have liked to have been in trying to nudge them to at least acknowledge that, you know, how can the biggest problem be settlements when you know, Arab hostility to Israel and to pre-state Israel, of course, goes back decades and decades before the settlements began. And also along that line, something interesting happened in the Telegraph, and just when you read the news every day like we do, there was a story in the Telegraph by their New Jerusalem correspondent, James Rothwell, that made a fleeting reference to the 1967 Six-Day War, and he referred to it as Israel's defensive war. Now, I tweeted that just because I thought that was fantastic, and just it reminded me that no one else does that. Like, and that's important, really important point, because your average news consumer could be forgiven for believing that Israel just woke up one morning and decided to destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground for no particular reason, when in fact, you know, not only were the Arabs about to launch a war, Israel would have been annihilated. They wouldn't have been able to withstand absorb a first strike. You know, every now and then you see a little bit of progress, and I thought that was interesting because the word defensive is such an important part of the context when talking about that war.
Hadar, could you?
Yeah, the political. Why do I say that the BBC's approach to terrorism is political? Because they actually wrote it down at one point. I can't remember which. I think it was the Westminster Bridge attack in London. which was all over the BBC described as terrorism. And one of our readers actually took my posts about comparing BBC reporting of terrorism in the UK and BBC reporting of terrorism in Israel, often using the same methods, took it and decided to run with it and made a complaint to the BBC, which had to go through the whole process, the whole three-stage process. And their eventual answer was that if there is an ongoing military conflict, it's not terrorism. And if there isn't, it is. Except the guys on who did the attack on London Bridge identified with ISIS. And Britain was part of the coalition fighting ISIS. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, there was an ongoing military conflict there. It might have been several thousand miles away, but Britain was still involved in a conflict. And so this was their excuse why they don't use the word terrorism in Israel, because it's an ongoing conflict and because it's judgmental.
Okay, now Glasgow Friends of Israel was established about 6 years ago, and we've been on Buchanan Street every Saturday with our stall talking to people about the Middle East situation. But of course, recently, because of the coronavirus, we've not been able to be there. But I'd like to ask you both if you think grassroots organizations can have an impact on this topic. And also everybody that's on the call on this meeting tonight is to some extent an advocate for peace, and how you think they could be more effective in possibly challenging these media outlets when they see a story that they believe to be unfair or untrue.
Well, I think there's two main ways in which grassroots pro-Israel organizations like Glasgow Friends of Israel do and can help. Number one is to send us tips. You know, as much as Hadar and I tried, we sometimes miss stories that contain an error about Israel. And so a lot of the grassroots groups like Glasgow, Sussex, Northwest have been very good at tweeting or emailing or WhatsApping us when they come across something really problematic in The Guardian, The Independent, or the BBC. That's number one. Number two is that, you know, and I hope you come out of this maybe inspired to help us by not only giving us tips, but using your own, you know, computer and going online and making the complaint yourself. You know, the more voices complaining about an issue, the better. So I was hoping, you know, so to the degree that your members feel empowered to, next time they see something that's violates the accuracy clause of the editor's code, to actually go to the publication and make a complaint yourself. The third area, I guess I said two, but there's really three areas. And that is just that you guys are great at the fact that you're on the ground. You're at the BDS protests. You're keeping an eye and giving us in Israel a sense of what's going on there in the ground, what Palestine Solidarity Campaign is up to. You know, what's going on the ground. How bad is it for pro-Israel activists? How bad is it for Jews in Scotland, in Glasgow? So just, you know, touching base with you, with Simon Cobbs, with the heads of the grassroots organizations, just to know what's going on in terms of anti-Semitism, what's going on in terms of anti-Israel activism, and what you're doing to push back. And that's invaluable, because we're not there. We're both in Israel. So that's really, really helpful.
So we could, everybody on this call tonight, if they send you information, you can maybe confirm at the end what email address they could possibly contact you on. And if they see anything they believe should be challenged, they can contact you directly.
Sure, absolutely.
Hadar, what would you say to my question?
I seriously think that the grassroots groups like Glasgow Friends of Israel, I think it's the most important thing to have happened in the history of British Jewry in years. And I think it shows a real switch, a switch from keep your head down to proactive. And I mean, when I was trying to deal with my local PSC in the UK in 2006 to 2010, there was no group like that. There was nobody. It was me on my own. And I think it's a really important step forward. Even worse, when I first arrived back in my hometown, I arrived in November, and then there was, there are roughly sort of 3.5 Jews in that town. And but they put an advert in the local paper that they were having a Hanukkah party. So I went to the Hanukkah party, and they made very, very clear to me that I was Israeli. It was a problem because I was Israeli, and that they didn't want to get tarred with the same brush as me. And I think that dynamic has changed a lot. And I think really that these grassroots groups are the best thing that's ever happened to British Jewry, at least in the last century or so. And as Adam says, it's cooperation, it's communication, it's keeping us. There's two of us. We're trying to do the whole of the British media. It's quite a job. Keeping us informed, especially about maybe smaller publications that we aren't always aware of, local things, eyes on the ground. And also it works the other way as well, because I sometimes put up posts and then British friends say, okay, write to my MP about that, and that gets things rolling as well and gets things moving. And I don't know if you're aware of the recent story there was with BBC Arabic, which did a horrible puff piece on Ahlam Tamimi, the woman involved in the Sbarro pizza bombing. They did a very sympathetic interview with her, and the BBC has since apologized, but a lot of that is because of pressure from people who wrote to their MPs about this piece, that we have an Arabic department. So our Arabic department translated it, and we posted in English, and we highlighted it, and then people could send this to their MPs. And I think the cooperation between grassroots groups in the UK and people like us is absolutely invaluable.
I'm going to open up to the audience in a minute, but I know that recently, Adam, you picked up the topic of the Israel-Scotland football match and the reports in some of our press. And maybe you can tell people how you picked that up and what you did about it and what happened.
Yeah, well, you're talking about the story that happened a couple of months ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If I recall, that was involved a mischaracterization of the people involved with the protest. Tell me, are you thinking of something else, or?
Well, whatever you remember, that's fine. I mean, there was a problem with the SPSC, who were demonstrating outside Hampden Park. And there was a story in the paper, in the Record, I think, that you maybe picked up, if you remember.
Yeah, I'm actually having a hard time remembering that story. I do know that David Collier did a fantastic job recently of exposing the extremist activists that were behind the anti-Israel protest at the Scotland-Israel football match. And he gave, as he always does, through thorough research, he actually ahead of the protest actually gave the Scottish media outlets information just so they won't cover the protest, characterizing the protesters as being pro-peace, but that they were actually extremists, that a lot of the individuals involved in these anti-Israel protests, a lot of the PSC activists were actually have long histories on Facebook of engaging in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. And that's there's another actually example of a grassroots activist, David Collier, helping us by doing the legwork, doing the research, and giving the media information that they wouldn't normally cover.
Okay, thanks very much. There was a comment made earlier on by Maureen Farstone that when they do, if ever, issue an apology, the media outlets, by the time they issue the apology, everybody's forgotten about what actually happened and it loses its impact. What I'd like to do, though, is open up the session to people who want to ask Adam or Hadar any questions. So if anybody's keen to put their hand up, and we'll try and unmute them and see. David, I can see. Gina, can we open up David Goldberg first, and then after that, Natalie? David.
Can you? Yes, good evening, everybody. And Hadar, very nice to see you again. I well remember your visit to Glasgow, and then subsequently you and I were in quite a degree of contact. Just a very brief comment, if I may, and then one very specific question. The comment is that, you know, what I've heard a lot from Adam particularly is Guardian independent, and only one brief reference to the Telegraph, which was positive because it used the word defensive for the 67 war. And so clearly there's a sort of dynamic, isn't there, between the media and its readership. And to some extent, it's slightly one side of the coin to talk about what the media publishes without also referring to the other side of the content of the coin, which is, you know, what its kind of paradigmatic readership actually is. And, you know, the Guardian and the Independent are not popular in the sense of something like the Daily Mail. They are not popular newspapers. So I think there's something about the dynamic between the particular medium and its readership, which needs to be teased out. But that's just a comment which would be nice to discuss over a scotch or a glass of wine or a nice dinner, and you don't need to make any response to that. Hadar, the specific question I have is, and I was mentioning this to Sammy the other day, the BBC is in an interesting moment because it and incidentally Ofcom too are both in the position of just being about to appoint or going into the process of appointing new chairs. And I understand, and you can correct me, Hadar, if the reports that Charles Moore was going to be the chair of the BBC Trust, he now seems to have withdrawn. And I wonder whether you feel that there is do you have a name? Who would you like to see as the chair of the BBC Trust? And would it be pertinent in terms of a direct contact with the chair to give your dossier of, you know, bias or inaccuracies, because that hardly redounds very well on that person's organization that she or he will inherit? Thank you.
Well, I think first of all we have to sort of wait and see what happens, because these things are very political in nature. I'm honestly not sure how much influence the BBC chairman can have. And I think I mean, David Clementi was people had high hopes for him, and he seems to have got sort of sucked into the system and conformed with the system in actual fact. And same with Ofcom, you know, I can tell you that when they renewed the charter in 2016, and Ofcom, for the first time ever, the BBC is not totally self-regulating, and Ofcom took actually control of part of the complaints process. I flew to London and I had a meeting with Ofcom. I actually, a few months before that, I'd sent them a sort of cheeky email saying, "Hi Ofcom, I hear you're going to be regulating the BBC. Would you like to hear all about them from me? I've been monitoring them for years." And then they sent me a polite refusal back, and I thought, okay, it was worth a try. And then they sent me another email saying, "Can you be here in 2 weeks?" And I said, okay. And so I went and I met with Ofcom and I explained what the problems were, and I brought them documentation, which I left with them, and tons of paperwork, and nothing's happened. Nothing's happened. Ofcom has been, from my point of view, a very big disappointment. Things haven't improved at all. If anything, I think maybe they've got worse, because now the BBC can say, okay, we've got the Ofcom stamp of approval for things that really do need correcting. I'm very reluctant to make any predictions about the BBC chairman, because A, I've no idea who it's going to be, and I don't know if anybody has. They seem to be falling by the wayside quite quickly. And as I say, I'm really not sure. I think it's such an institution where the wheels, to some extent, work by themselves. I'm not sure a chairman can really make that much difference.
Thank you. Natalie Elgrove, please, you have a question? We'll just get you unmuted first, Natalie. Gina?
I'm trying to.
Can anybody else put up their hands for the next question? Okay, Natalie.
Now,
Okay,
yeah, okay.
Yep.
I've seen this so many times. What can be done, if anything, of a headline, and it's only half the fact, or it's getting the headline like back to front? Example, headline: Palestinian Arab shot dead by IDF. It isn't untrue, but it's a consequence of what the Palestinian had done. But that first part can be admitted, and that's misleading. Is it misleading on purpose, do you think? I mean, do you think they do that? All right, you can read the full article and possibly get the full facts, but usually, or very often, someone will just read a headline and they'll take that as face value. Do you think that's done on purpose to put Israel in a bad light?
Generally speaking, I think the answer to that is yes. I think that that's clickbait. I think that they think that their readers are more likely to buy the paper or click the link to the article if the headline has a sensationalist tag that basically accuses Israel of killing Palestinians. Now, they could tweak the headline and write, Palestinian attacks Israeli soldiers, IDF fires back. But that doesn't really sell that article. I think to some degree, they are giving their news consumers what they want. But let me tell you, we've gotten corrections. That seems like a really bad headline. We've gotten corrections on headlines too. I don't think we mentioned about that, but we do go after headlines that are substantively misleading. And in fact, at Camera, we had a whole webpage, a constantly updated webpage devoted just to the bad headlines when we were in the midst of that stabbing intifada from 2015 to 2017. So thanks for bringing that up, because headlines have an enormously negative impact on Israel. Most people don't read the full article. They see the headline. And like I said, though, I think it is intentional to the degree that either that's the story that they want to convey, or they know that that's what their readers want to see. And the headline is actually one of the most damaging parts of articles very often.
Mm-hmm. And I think I mentioned this when I came to Glasgow to talk to you all, but there was in 2015, there was a horrible, October, I think it was 2015, there was an awful terror attack in the old city in Jerusalem. And the BBC had a headline, Palestinian killed as Jerusalem attack kills 2, or something like that. Palestinian shot dead as Jerusalem attack kills 2. And what people were supposed to understand from that, I really don't know. And I can't stress the usefulness of Twitter in a situation like that. Because as soon as this came up on the BBC website, I happened to be on Twitter as it came out. And I immediately tweeted them back. Okay, Palestinian dead, who killed him? Jerusalem didn't kill anybody. What's a Jerusalem attack? What's that stupid phrase, you know? And it took an hour, and it took them 4 attempts to get it right. And in the end, within an hour, they got a reasonable headline. But I just kept, and I know other people joined in, of course, just kept on at them, tweeting them. No, that's not good enough. Do it again.
Thank you, Hadar. I see the next hand is going to be somebody called Haifa Diarist, but before I let you speak, because I can't see who it is, it's interesting that sometimes the story is written by the journalist, but it's actually the editor that constructs the headline.
Yeah.
And therefore the editor may have a different point of view from the journalist who wrote the story. And you very often get sort of contradicting information between the headline and the story itself. But the journalist himself...
The editor might not actually know what the story is really about, you know, might not have read it properly.
Exactly, and they just put a headline that they might want to see in the paper as the headline for that story. Okay, I don't know who Haifa Diarist is, so maybe you could introduce yourself. He'll introduce himself, I'm sure.
Hi, Sammy. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, the name is Stuart Palmer. The Haifa Diarist is my blog name. And I say hi to both your wonderful speakers tonight. I take my hat off to both of them for the efforts that they're making. I want to make 2 points, actually. Regarding the BBC, it's a constant battle to try and get them to change what is intrinsically a negative attitude towards Israel. My late brother worked for the BBC for something like 50 years. And another contact that I have that worked nothing to do with politics or news, but in the music department, both reporting on the intrinsic problem they have in getting a wide range of journalists into the BBC. Anybody that doesn't seem to approach a story in the way they want it will not be accepted. There is a story which I don't know how true it is, but I was told many times that a potential interviewer would always ask an interviewee, which newspaper do you read? And if you didn't read The Guardian, there would be little chance of getting a job at the BBC. The other thing is that one particular case in point, after a lecture that I'd given many years ago, somebody from Essex wrote to me and just simply said, why are the Israelis stealing Palestinian water? And after giving a lot of information by email from the annual report from the Water Commissioner's Office, he wrote to me and said, I can't accept this conversation from you any longer. All you're doing is quoting me facts. And I think that this is a mindset within the BBC that is going to be very difficult to change. It's rather like a judiciary that is selecting people of its own type to propagate the present situation going on and on.
Thank you. Adam, why don't we look for the next question here? You mentioned the Jewish roads, the only Jewish roads that people write about. That's something that happens here quite a lot. People speak about that quite a lot. And I was wondering if you'd be able to send me some information on that we might be able to use locally if that question comes up again.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to, yes.
Okay, I'm looking for the next person who wants to ask. John Copeland is the next guy. Gina, please. Just unmute me, John. You need to mute yourself as well. John, you need to mute yourself. We can't hear you, John. John. Right.
Okay, is that working now?
Yes, it's working now.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk tonight. There's just one thing I was thinking is dawning on me, for the last several months is that in journalism, we assume that the journalist is either ideologically committed to a storyline, shall we say, or is working for his boss in a way, the editors or the producer of the magazine, the newspaper. But it's dawning on me that there's another area, and that's bribery, basic bribery and corruption. I wonder if there's journalists are slanting stories for some money in the back pocket, basically. It's maybe a thing that you can't prove and all that, but I just wonder if that's a part of the story as well. Thanks.
I haven't seen anything to support that. I mean, I obviously it's a bit of a speculation, but I've never seen it. I mean, I have sort of a general rule in life: never assign to malice what can be explained by stupidity. But I've never seen any evidence of that. But I don't think it's necessary, even, in a lot of cases. I think some people who are even serious journalists. I mean, there are a lot of unserious journalists around today. You've seen it with the Canary and all these weird British things that have come up in the recent Labour Party scandal. But some serious journalists, I honestly don't think that it's very difficult for them to get dragged into a mindset. And bear in mind, these are people that's their income, that's their career plan, that's the way they get promoted, and you don't get promoted by going against the system.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with. I've seen no evidence of to support the charge that there's any financial dealings, but you know, I think it comes down to, there's so many simple things that I think the simpler answers are more likely to be true. And that is, you know, there was an interesting article in Tablet by Barry Weiss on the horrible state of journalism at the New York Times and the horrible state of journalism when it comes to covering Jews and Israel. And, you know, she used this term, and it's such a simple term, but she said, you know, a lot of journalists are failing to cover Israel fairly and failing to really take anti-Semitism on the left seriously because they want to be the cool kids. They want to be part of the cool group. In other words, like, you know, if you want to be popular, if you want to be part of the journalistic clique in Jerusalem and sip beers with them at the American Colony Hotel, you know, you better get with the program. I mean, you know, it goes back, you know, I remember, you know, if you go back to what it was like in grade school or middle school, you know, I think life's very similar. I think for a lot of these journalists, this is just being pro-Palestinian is what you do. It's just part of what you do to be part of the cool group. And part of it's, like I said, also just, I think they're consider themselves to be activists. So, you know, they think they're making the world better. But, you know, I think just peer pressure is a huge, huge motivator, and I wouldn't underestimate the impact of that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Noreen Firestone.
Hi. Hi. This is me from Carmiel in Israel, originally from Glasgow. Hello, Eddie Mandel. It's Noreen here, and hello, Stuart. I just have a comment to make. It's all very well when they put apologies, but by the time the apology is published, the wrong story has been read and accepted by so many people. I wonder what your thoughts are about this. How much effect do the apologies actually have?
Well, thanks for the question. Remember that, you know, I mentioned this before, but I'm glad that you asked it again. The most important thing is, here's are the two important things about corrections. Number one, forget about the print publication. The online version of that article, if it's corrected, if it's revised, it'll be on the internet forever, meaning whenever that article is clicked on Google, you know, the corrected version will appear, and most people get their news online. Not this print publication will, you know, is dramatically less important to the public conversation than it used to be. So there's that. The second thing is, like I said, there is a tendency of editors to take it seriously and not want to be embarrassed. So when they get something wrong and they have to admit it, they don't want to make the same mistake again. So I think if you look at the big picture, there's a cumulative impact of corrections on the news cycle, on the editors. So in leaving aside the tiny little correction on page 837, it's online and it has a cumulative effect on future coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
It's also useful, you know, when I complain to the BBC about things, and this is a tip I can give you if you're complaining to any media organization, I usually try to have a look and see if they've actually corrected the same thing before. Because if they have, it makes my life a lot easier. And
Right.
it makes it a lot easier to get a correction the second time or a third time.
Thank you, Hadar. Ronnie, I see you are looking to ask a question. Most people won't know that you're getting in touch from the US. So Gina, could we please unmute Ronnie? Thank you. Okay.
Not only are we from the US, we're from West Virginia, which is a unique part of the US. Anyway, maybe I'll ask Adam this. Is there any validity to, which I've heard over a period of years, that reporters that are on the scene in Israel are threatened to some degree and want to protect their ability to go into, say, Gaza or the West Bank, and if they write anything that's factual that might turn out to be, you know, not follow their particular narrative, that they won't be allowed to report from those. There'll be hostility toward them. They won't be allowed to report anymore from those territories. So that in order to protect their source, their ability to get in, just to get a story, they will slant things to Israel's detriment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, that's true. In 2014, during what was it, Protective Edge, that the last war, there were actually journalists who were international media outlets who were reporting from Gaza, whose journalists were sometimes tweeting, sometimes they'd report this after the war, that they said there was an atmosphere of intimidation, that they were threatened or bullied or sent the message by Hamas officials that their coverage, to the degree that it was critical of Hamas and critical of Gaza, was going to result in some unfavorable results. And that's really been forgotten. Now, the question is to what degree after the war that continued to happen. It's hard to say because the war really focuses things. And during the war, I think some journalists were more upfront because of the intensity of it all, because that's what journalists live for, is to cover conflicts. So I think there was definitely admissions at the time by journalists that they were being intimidated by Hamas. But the question is whether or not this year, previous years that where there's not a war, whether or not there similar intimidation by Hamas. And it's hard to know for sure, but I think if it happened in 2014, I think it's safe to say, knowing Hamas, it's probably safe to say that that's at least a factor in their coverage. I don't think it's as much of a factor as it was during conflict, but I think in my view, there's enough information to conclude that that is a factor in their coverage, that kind of intimidation does prevent articles critical of Hamas.
Thanks.
Thank you. While I'm looking for the next question, could you both say something about the Gaza demonstrations and the stories coming out of Gaza when the terrorists were killed and people have not acknowledged the fact that most of them were terrorists, and Israel was
the Great March of Return.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, that was a political exercise organized by Hamas. I actually wrote a post 2 weeks before it started. I had information on the background and how they were planning and what they were going to do. And I actually wrote a post, hey, BBC, this is what's going to happen, just so you know all the information is here. It was again, it fitted into this sort of story of the David and Goliath and the poor little Gazan with a couple of rocks in his hand and the Israelis with their big guns. And it was totally distorted. The number of casualties as well was distorted because I don't know about other organizations, but the BBC took, the health ministry in the Gaza Strip is run by Hamas. So it's not exactly a reliable organization. And they were taking the stats from the health ministry in Gaza, who counted everybody who coughed a bit because of tear gas as an injury. So there was a lot of overstatement on that point of view. And it was used, again, it was used to advance a political narrative. And that's something we see very, very often. There's a narrative and the events that happen on the ground are used to advance this particular narrative.
Adam?
Yeah, I mean, not much data than to say that, journalists oftentimes cynically talk about how silly Israelis are, Israelis and their Hasbara, as we're trying to sell them this pro-Israeli narrative. Well, during the March of Return, they bought Hamas Hasbara. Call it what you want to know what the Arabic word is for that, but Hamas somehow was effective at crafting a message that journalists wanted to hear, that they wanted to sell, that they wanted to frame, and they were successful. And even after the fact that when Hamas admitted that on that one violent riot, the overwhelming majority of those killed were Hamasniks, still there was a reluctance by media outlets to acknowledge that. So, look, I think that Hamas and Palestinians oftentimes know their customer, and they know what message sells. They know what message that journalists want to carry, and so they craft their talking points and they craft the events to align with that narrative. So that was a perfect example.
Okay, I don't see any more hands, so I'd like to ask you two more questions and then we might wrap up. Oh, I see a hand. It's the lady with Ronnie. So I don't know your name, I'm afraid.
That's okay. Actually, I am Ronnie, and that's
Oh,
Norman.
you're Ronnie.
But
Okay.
it doesn't matter.
He must be called Fox. He's Fox, right?
That's my maiden name. That's Ronnie Fox Glazer and Norman Glazer here.
All right. Ronnie, if you ask a question.
Also known as Adam's cousins. But two things. One, just as a Jew, and of course, and anyone who's just pro-Israel, you have to appreciate the work that Adam and Hadar do. I mean, it just because it's good for us all, no matter where we are. But also, which I never even thought about, just when seeing Adam was going to be part of this discussion, that there is a Glasgow Friends of Israel, and I think that's just heartwarming to hear now. There's another network of people who support Israel in the world, and there's probably many more, but now we know about Glasgow Friends of Israel, and I just think that's just grand that you guys are doing that work. And
thank you, Ronnie. We'll send you some information about our organization.
okay, thank you.
I'd like just to ask both of you to comment on a couple of things. One is the recent normalization between Israel and the UAE and of course now Sudan as well. And also what you might think would happen sooner or later when Mahmoud Abbas, he can't have too long to go now. And I was wondering what you think might happen when he passes away. If you could just give us your own point of view on that.
Well, I mean, I think that these peace treaties have given lie to the conventional wisdom that the road to Arab-Israeli peace drives through Jerusalem. You know, it just purely, if there's been anything that just is so clearly contradicts the assumption that there'll never be a wider Arab-Israeli peace unless there's Israeli-Palestinian peace, we're seeing it in front of our eyes each week. Not just UAE and Bahrain and Sudan, but possibly Oman, possibly Saudi Arabia, possibly others. So I think that's a huge paradigm shift. Now, whether or not the media will acknowledge that, I'm not optimistic. So that's huge. As far as what happens after Mahmoud Abbas, you know, I'm gonna have to just be honest, I'm really not sure. I don't see any dramatic shift in Palestinian Authority positions, but you know, I'm not optimistic. I see very little evidence that there's any Palestinian street, you know, clamming for a change in their leadership's attitude towards Israel, or that there's any sort of paradigm shift within Palestinian society so that they would choose someone that was a little more pragmatic in pursuing peace with Israel. So other than to say, I don't know, I'll say that sadly, I'm not optimistic.
Hadar?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've all been eulogizing Mahmoud Abbas for a long time now and nothing's happened, but I would say, I mean, the word at the moment is that maybe Jibril Rajoub is the next in line. I don't know. We'll have to see. There's Shtaya, the current prime minister. Again, it's the old guard. The old guard will not give up Fatah very easily, I don't think. There is no younger generation with you know, different and more liberal ideas. Anybody who has more liberal ideas doesn't last very long in that society. I wouldn't at all be surprised to try to see Hamas trying to do some sort of a takeover when Abbas goes. It wouldn't surprise me at all. They've been very, very active in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, setting up cells in recent years. And I think it's certainly a possibility that you can't rule out. And as Adam says, these latest surprise normalization deals, it really has sort of turned the game around. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. I think things have been changing roughly since this sort of Arab springtime in 2011. I think there's been a big paradigm shift in the Middle East generally. And a lot of countries saying, hey, the most important thing isn't the Palestinians, it's what's happening with us. I mean, I live literally 10 minutes away from the border with Syria here, and during the war, it was part of a very important part of my life. It was my soundtrack for very many years. We had the Syrians coming into Israel for medical help. That's changed a lot of opinions in Syria, our arch enemies. But you know, Israel treated these people. They came over the border, and it's made things change. And I see shifts in the Middle East. I mean, it's very early days and it's very small green shoots, but I think there are definite reasons to be optimistic. Not so much with regard to the Palestinians, but with the rest of the Middle East, Ken. Yeah.
Do you think if more countries normalize relationships with Israel, the Palestinians might be forced to make some sort of peace agreement, or will make them less important?
I think at some point they're going to have to realize that as time goes on, they're just losing more. I mean, they could have solved this problem 30 years ago and got a lot more than is on the table now. There was the Olmert offer in 2008. That was maximum that Israel can give. In fact, it was a little bit more maximum that Israel can give. There isn't going to be any better than that. But until they accept that, until they, give up on this idea of the right of return for Palestinian refugees, which isn't going to happen. Sorry, it's not going to happen. Until they give up on that, there's no chance. Until they agree to recognize Israel as the Jewish state, which means the end of the conflict, not we make a deal now and then in a few years we'll have something else to complain about. It's not going to happen. And I think that, I mean, Israelis are maybe a little bit more cynical. We were in the Oslo days in '93, you know, we were all very optimistic and peace and love and so on and so forth. And then came the Second Intifada, and that was a wake-up call for a lot of us. A lot of us who had been in favor of Oslo realized that it wasn't just about us. It wasn't about us, what we were doing only. There's another side to this story, and we need them to cooperate as well. We need them to put their 50% in before there can be a peace agreement. And you know, I mean, people say to me, why don't you make peace with the Palestinians? And my first question is, which Palestinians? The ones in Gaza or the ones in Ramallah? Because it's two different completely groups of people who can't even get on between themselves. So I'm not quite sure why you want me to make, or how you want to make me to make peace with two groups of people that can't even get along by themselves.
Thank you, Hadar. Adam, anything before we go?
Just to recommend a book, since Hadar mentioned that their Palestinians are going to have to give up on the right of return. There's a book out by Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf called The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. I'd highly recommend reading it. It's really a good explanation as to just how harmful the idea of the Palestinian right of return has been on peace. It's a really quick read, but it's a very informative read.
Einat was actually one of our guest speakers not long ago, and she gave us the most wonderful lecture with regards to this area. Anyway, I think we have to remember that you're 2 hours ahead of us, so it's probably past your bedtime now. So I'd like to thank you both very much indeed for spending time with us tonight and giving us your views and your thoughts about the British media and the work that you do. And I'm sure many of us would like to try and help you as much as we can. So if you send me some information about how you can be contacted, I will make sure that anybody that's on the meeting tonight, if they want that information, I'll pass it back. So
yeah, there's a contact us form on our website, but we'll send it to you separately. And hope to be in Glasgow soon and come to visit you all.
Indeed, it will be very nice to see you again. So thank you so much from everybody on the meeting tonight. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.